What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be doing a video essentially on criticizing some of the criticisms of my critiques on periodization. Or really why I'm doing this video is today I uploaded a story just sort of describing some of the changes we've made in one of my weightlifters' microcycles. And then I get all these DMs, people being like, why are you talking about microcycles for? You were the one that told everyone that periodization is dumb and you don't need to periodize your training. So when I criticize periodization, I'm talking about it in a very classical or traditional sense. And so while I am a massive critic of a majority of the concepts that have emerged from classical periodization, I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying that you shouldn't plan your training at all. I put a lot of thought into planning all of my clients' training, including my own. It's just that with our approach here at General Physical Preparation, we just take things 1 week at a time. And we have a lot of scientific principles or frameworks that underpin this process. Another point I want to address is a lot of coaches that I have a pretty significant amount of respect for, when I bring up a lot of my criticisms of traditional periodization and its rigid application, these coaches will sort of clap back and say, well, these are just common sense things. All good coaches do these things intuitively. But my response to that is, well, if we have explicit frameworks to describe these things, why can't we use them as teaching tools, especially for new coaches? Most of my work is still done in educating coaches, not just new coaches, but also coaches who've been around for 10 years. So I feel like I have a good understanding of where the average coach is at in their understanding of applying traditional periodization concepts a little too rigidly. And I agree that a lot of coaches, with 10 years in the game, are going to start to work out these things intuitively by trial and error. But we can save coaches so much time in making all these mistakes if we have the frameworks to better explain the planning of training to them up front with more modern scientific principles that are actually up to date. Not just, the best we could do back in the Cold War, or even a lot of the concepts that underpin traditional or classical periodization emerged in the 1920s with Hans Selye and his general adaptation syndrome model. And so that's the main thing I want to talk about in today's video, just re-clarifying some of the things that I really don't like about the traditional approach to the planning of training, otherwise known as periodization to some people. And then I'm going to outline all of the frameworks that have dramatically shifted my practice and my decision-making process when it comes to planning the training for my athletes. Due to unnecessary fears about the interference effect or the inability to train multiple physical or athletic qualities simultaneously, a lot of coaches will periodize their training with very specific focuses on different qualities from block to block, with either very little or no inclusion of any other physical qualities. And not just that we have to do individual blocks dedicated to these individual physical qualities, but there's this very predictable process you can apply to getting your desired outcome. So a really simple example of this would be an athlete comes to a coach wanting to improve their squat. And straight off rip, if you're a fan of classical periodization, we're like, I know exactly what I need to do with you. We're going to enter an accumulation phase, or other people will call this a hypertrophy block. Then we'll work on a more specific strength block. And then we'll finish off with a little bit of a shorter peaking block. We're actually going to finally feed you some heavy squat singles and try to hit a PR. And honestly, this isn't even necessarily a bad way to approach improving someone's squat. It's just that there's 1,000,001 other ways to do it. And in my opinion, there's a lot better ways to go about it as well that will likely suit the individual athlete a lot better than just being like, oh, you want your squat to go up? All right, here's exactly what we do. Map out this whole training cycle 12 weeks in advance. Boom, there's your squat PR on this testing day here. And so not only do we have all this pre-planned sequencing of the blocks, the block length is completely predetermined. The weight progressions in terms of percentages are all completely mapped out in advance as well. And if you know your history, and especially your history of sports science, you can understand where all these really rigid and predictive components of periodization emerged from. A lot of these ideas emerged or were refined in the USSR, which is a real collectivist, like one way to do it to suit everyone, screw individuality sort of society. And if you look at their understanding of stress which was general adaptation syndrome, which was actually developed by a Canadian, but in the USSR, they called it supercompensation. Because if you really want to understand good programming or periodization, you have to understand stress at a really deep level, because at least in the way that I look at it, and I don't think this is too controversial of a statement, periodization or programming is just the controlled application of stress to the human system to try and drive certain desired outcomes. But if you still hold this view that general adaptation syndrome is the gold standard when it comes to our understanding of how humans respond to stress, you're stuck in the 1920s. And this isn't to criticize Hans Selye. I'm sure if he was still alive and practicing to this day, he definitely would have refined his ideas on stress over time and understood that humans don't actually respond that rigidly to stress. The actual experiments he ran to develop general adaptation syndrome were done on rats, not humans anyway. And then, like I said, that theory of stress that he worked out by torturing rats was then just like the central stress theory that we based all of this periodization protocols on. And so what general adaptation syndrome is trying to describe is this really predictable and purely biological response to stress. And so it's this idea that the subject is in a state of homeostasis and the body is always wanting to return to homeostasis. It is then disrupted or alarmed by this application of stress. Eventually the system reaches a certain level of fatigue, and then you reduce the amount of stress so that the system can recover and reach this new homeostasis with all these new levels of adaptation. So bigger, stronger, faster, depending on the particular stimulus or stressor that you're applying to the system. This is also why coaches love being rigid with their either 4 or 6 week blocks. There's no customization for the athlete because the individual response to stress is ignored in this system. And it's like, oh no, everyone responds to stress just like this. But we're real humans and there's a few more factors affecting our stress response. Whereas rat in a lab with no prefrontal cortex and in a very controlled setting, I'm sure it does have a very predictable response to stress. Whereas my understanding of how humans respond to stress comes from this term known as allostasis. And I'll be honest, I didn't learn about allostasis up front. I was just inspired by different people in the field, such as Mike Tuchscherer, Mladen Jovanovic, and then that led to me going down the John Kiley rabbit hole, and that's where I was like, oh, boom, this is the core of all this stuff. Understanding that humans have an allostatic response to stress. Humans aren't these homeostatic systems, we are allostatic systems. And we were never in homeostasis to begin with. Like, since you've been born, you've been in a permanent state of flux. Now I'm actually just going to read you a quick paragraph from the man himself, John Kiley, on how he would describe allostasis, and then I'll sort of give my 2 cents. Okay, so in the words of John Kiley, allostasis suggests that organisms maintain physiological stability by anticipating needs before they arise, and by mobilizing a diverse breadth of neurological, biological, and immunological accommodations to counter these emerging challenges. To facilitate this prediction, multi-source information streams are blended with expectations and prior experiences to estimate the threat posed by upcoming challenges. Subsequent to this prediction, multiple preemptive remediating actions calibrated to that perceived threat are reflexively launched to protect current and future function, thereby promoting survivability. So again, going back to this out-of-date idea that humans are these homeostatic systems, we're actually this allostatic system that is always trying to find stability within its environment. And as there is varying degrees of stability in our environment on a day-to-day basis and throughout the training process, our system is constantly recalibrating itself. And like I said, a lot of this is just in anticipation of these stresses. And it's so much deeper than this purely biological, predictable response. All your thoughts, beliefs, expectations based on prior experiences, they have a huge effect on this stress response. And this is where we're already rubbing up alongside some other really interesting frameworks that have, whether or not they've pivoted or really changed my programming style, if anything, they've given me more confidence to sort of double down on my take on programming and the planning of training. And one of those ideas is dynamic systems theory, or dynamical systems theory. I just really hate the sound of the word dynamical. I would rather say dynamic, and they sort of, to me, they mean the same thing. If someone can explain the difference between dynamic and dynamical, please in the comments pop off. Essentially, dynamic systems theory is an area of mathematics where we've got these equations that have multiple variables and there's never one specific answer. There are multiple answers, or potentially infinite answers to any of these questions. And you're essentially just trying to find a set of conditions where this complex, dynamic, multivariate system will find some level of stability. And I don't think it's too controversial to suggest that humans are these multivariable systems made up of systems. And again, it's one of the reasons why there's no one perfect answer to these equations is it's really hard to judge or calculate the specific interplay between all these variables and how they affect one another. To illustrate this with an example, I think even the dumbest trainer knows that we've got so many different variables that can have a huge influence on the training process. You've got the sets, reps, and intensity, like the actual training prescription itself. But then the athlete's nutrition is going to have an impact. Their sleep, their stress outside of training is going to have a huge impact. And even though, we do have a decent understanding of these relationships, like, starving yourself is going to make it harder to get stronger. Only sleeping 4 hours a night is probably going to disrupt the training performance and adaptations. So we definitely understand these general relationships. But as far as being able to specifically understand the interaction of these variables, no, I don't know exactly how many kilos are going to go missing off your squat if you undereat that week. I can't quantify how losing 1 hour's sleep is going to specifically affect any given workout, but I know generally how they interact. And even when faced with this conundrum, so all these circumstances I just mentioned are present, and all of a sudden my athlete's not progressing the way that I want them to, taking this dynamic systems theory approach to things, I know that I have multiple levers to pull. I still won't be able to predict the outcome, but there's so many potential answers to this equation. It would be great if my athlete could just sleep more, but maybe they just had a new kid or their work schedule's all blown up or something like that. So while they can't sleep as much, maybe I can get them to focus on dialing in on their nutrition and getting a few more calories into the system. Or I have another lever to pull. I can change the sets and reps or intensity side of things on their training dose. So already, and I haven't even covered every option here, we have 3 different levers to pull. Maybe we could also add like a psychological lever. There's another lever we can pull around. All right, well, go read some David Goggins quotes because we're just gonna have to bite down on the mouthpiece and try harder. Anyway, the point is, whenever we have any sort of training conundrum where our athlete is not making progress, there's always multiple potential solutions to any given problem. The next framework that I want to talk about is the Biopsychosocial model, which was developed by George Engel in the 1970s. I believe it was quite revolutionary to the field of psychiatry, but these days, if you've learned about the BPS model, you've probably learned about it from more the rehab space or the physio side of things, because all the best physios, in my opinion, are adopting a much more biopsychosocial approach to rehab these days, and it's a lens that I think is extremely valuable to the performance space as well. The biopsychosocial model is just another great framework for something that most people understand completely intuitively. That stress is not just a biological experience, there's also psychological aspects of it and there's social aspects of it. Often crudely depicted as a Venn diagram where the bio, the psycho, and the social, or at least the bio and sometimes the psychosocial, get grouped together. But regardless, there should be no separation between any of them. They're all just completely intertwined and they're all just the same thing. It's like 3 lenses that you sort of slide over the top of one another and try to peer through simultaneously. So in a rehab context, this is a major reason why physios these days care so much more about pain education, telling people that they're extremely adaptable and that they're resilient, because your belief systems are such big drivers and have such a big impact on all these biological processes and experiences. Well, again, you wouldn't say that they're purely biological processes. They always have this inextricable psychosocial element to them. And this is where a lot of people sort of go off. They're like, okay, I understand the psychological aspect of stress, but what do you mean there's a social aspect of it as well? And to those people, I would say, do you ever remember when you were living at home with your parents and you come home from the gym with a blown out back from doing deadlifts and your mum's like, I knew that was going to happen to you. Why are you doing those bloody deadlifts? That's the social aspect of the biopsychosocial model. Or in a rehab context, it's your physio being like, oh, why'd you do deadlifts? That's why you're blowing your back out. You shouldn't be doing any of that. And you feel like a horrible person and you go through this shame spiral. Whereas more biopsychosocial practitioners who are aware of this lens, they're a little bit more careful in how they communicate these things to their client. Instead of just throwing someone straight on the table and being like, oh, you're missing hip internal rotation, Before they even go through any of that physiological assessment, they'll reassure the client, be like, hey man, you're probably fine. And so how I describe a biopsychosocial approach to training is just embracing the subjectivity of it. For all of this talk about optimal hypertrophy exercises, for example, doing lateral raises with a cuff instead of a D handle, or maybe with the cuff around your elbow, so you're removing the elbow instability and then holding onto the Bluetooth D handle. If that makes your client feel like a cuck, then it's not an optimal exercise because it's ruining the training process for them, right? Like they want to live action role play as Ronnie Coleman when they're doing their training accessories, not some kid on TikTok. So with the biopsychosocial approach, our idea of what optimal truly is, it shifts a little bit. And I guess to explain this using anti-fragile terminology, how we look at the science of training is that gives us our bandwidth of good enough. We know that so many different forms of lateral raises are good enough to do the job, growing your medial delts or lateral delt. You can do dumbbell lateral raise, you can do cable lateral raise with a D handle, you can go fully optimal and you can put the cuff around your humerus and hold your Bluetooth D handle or soccer shin pads I saw someone doing the other day. And how you work out which one of those is optimal for your client is you communicate. You ask your client, you're like, hey, all of these are good enough. What equipment do you have access to? What one makes you feel cool doing it? You embrace the subjectivity of the situation. You don't run away from it. That's a biopsychosocial approach to exercise prescription, for example. I guess just to summarize it, it's an overall, it pushes you to be much more collaborative as a coach and working with your client, communicating with them a lot more and asking them a lot more questions through the program design process, rather than just you being the all-knowing guru and be like, this version of a lateral raise is best, or this is the best squat pattern and this is how we're gonna do it. And this is where we touch on the final framework that I wanna talk about today, which is top down versus bottoms up, which again is a little bit more broad than just how we approach program design or periodization of training. Sort of stems from not the corporate world. Ultimately, I guess it stems from labor management. And this is why it's good. It's so easy to see examples of this, how the world has shifted to being a little more bottoms up over time. It's not just fitness that's going more bottoms up. And so what I mean when I say top down versus bottoms up, top down is much more authoritarian. I'm in charge as the coach or your boss. I'll tell you exactly what needs to be done and when to do it. Bottoms up is where you have a little bit more respect for the wishes of the athlete or your employee. It's like, look, there is a certain amount of work that needs to be done, but when is it best for you to do that work? And how would you like to approach this work? You see so many parallels for this outside of fitness. Like it's happening in the corporate world. Used to be, very top down. It's like, okay, well, you're going to work 9 to 5 and you're going to do it in the office. Whereas nowadays, there's so much more bottoms up. A lot more corporate entities are like, look, this is the work that you need to do. You figure out where it fits into your schedule. Just get the job done. Oh, do you want to do 2 days in the office or do you want to do 3 days in the office and the rest you can do work from home? Some great examples of top-down constraints that still need to be respected when it comes to training athletes. Competition dates are a top-down constraint. If you're a power lifter, squat, bench, and dead, it's a top-down constraint. If you want to be a good power lifter, you have to squat, bench, and dead in a specific way. Where the bottoms-up stuff sort of emerges is, how many days can you train per week? What fits in with your schedule? Out of all these effective accessory exercises outside of your competition squat, bench, and dead, like I said, even your secondary variations, it's like, do you like a tempo bench? Do you prefer a spoto press on your secondary bench day? What's your favorite bicep curl? This is also where we start to entertain things like auto-regulation and more RPE-based prescriptions rather than top-down percentage-based prescription. Not that there can't be bottoms-up components to a percentage-based intensity prescription. Instead of an RPE, if your client doesn't like those or you as a coach don't like those, you could have a percentage window, or even just prescribing weights. Like, hey, on Tuesday, you're going to squat 200 kilos. That would be a very top-down strategy, whereas the more bottoms-up strategy would be like, I want you to squat somewhere between 195 to 205 kilos. And I just want you to, as you're warming up, just be a bit thoughtful as you're warming up, check in with your body, be like, how am I really feeling today? And if you're not feeling so good in the warm-ups, then you can choose the lower range. If you're feeling really good in your warm-ups, then you have the upper range. So good coaching, in my opinion, is about balancing rigidity with flexibility. And the best framework for acknowledging this is top down versus bottoms up. You can see it everywhere in society. It's bigger than fitness. That's why it's such a good principle. Anyway, I completely understand why a lot of really good and especially more experienced coaches think that all of the changes I've made to my periodization model are common sense, or things that you can just work out on your own. Or maybe they describe them as the art of periodization. But the reality is all of these concepts have extraordinarily scientific underpinnings, and we have these frameworks, all the ones that I just mentioned, that we can introduce to young and emerging coaches so they don't have to work these things out for themselves, and so that they can be more confident in applying these concepts. Anyway, if you like the way I talk about program design, I've got whole units on it in my GPP Level 1 curriculum. I think it's the best value continuing education for coaches out there today. There's an amazing pre-recorded curriculum of lectures on all of these subjects. And then there's also lifetime ongoing support. You're in a Discord, there's 3 weekly Zoom calls. They also get recorded and uploaded to the Discord. So even if you can't make the calls, you can still submit questions and we can go into detail. Or if you don't want to watch the replays, you can just ask me questions, as many as you want in the Discord, and I'll help you not just with your understanding, but also then the application of all these amazing concepts. If you're not interested in signing up to GPP Level 1, YouTube is probably recommending 2 different videos here, so please go binge some more of my content, and I'll see you in the next video.